Okay, so we've got some really interesting stuff to dive into today.
Yeah.
This is one of those topics that, you start reading about it and you think, oh, this is pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
And then, the more you dig, the more questions
Right.
pop up.
Exactly.
So we're going to be talking about Lonar Lake in India.
Mm-hmm.
And this has been sent in by a bunch of you folks.
Yeah. Lots of interest.
Yeah. And I can see why.
Yeah.
On the surface, you look at it and you think, oh,
It's beautiful.
it's this beautiful, emerald green lake.
Yeah.
Nestled in this kind of stark Bussold landscape.
Right.
And it's almost a perfect circle.
It is. Yeah. It's really striking.
It's really striking. And then you start reading about it a little bit more and you're like, well, wait a minute, there's some things here that
Don't quite add up.
don't quite add up.
Yeah.
And so the official story is that it's a meteorite impact crater.
Right. That's the scientific consensus.
Right. But as I'm sure you folks have discovered in your research,
Yeah.
it doesn't quite
Doesn't satisfy
they
everyone.
don't quite satisfy everyone. Yeah.
Yeah. There are some gaps.
There are some gaps. And so we're gonna talk about, that whole kind of debate.
Mm-hmm.
But we're also going to get into some of the, the alternative theories, which are pretty fascinating.
Right. The whispers of aliens and ancient technologies.
Exactly. Yeah, and then, hidden history and all that.
All that good stuff.
Yeah, all that good stuff.
Yeah.
So, why don't we start just by, laying out
The foundation.
the foundation.
Yeah.
What's
the official story?
Yeah, the official story.
What does science say?
Yeah, what does science say? So,
Mm.
so if we were to go with, the conventional explanation,
Mm-hmm.
what are we talking about here in terms of, the creation of this lake?
Well, the prevailing theory and the one that has the most evidence to support it is that about 50,000 years ago,
Okay.
a large meteorite slammed into the earth.
Right here in India.
Right in what is now the Deccan Traps region of India.
Okay.
And this was a huge meteorite. We're talking millions of tons in weight.
Wow.
And it just, absolutely obliterated
Yeah.
the landscape when it hit.
I mean, just to create a crater that size,
Yeah,
which is now,
Yeah.
filled with water, is this lake.
exactly.
It had to have been a cataclysmic event.
Well, absolutely. A tremendous release of energy.
Yeah.
And that impact created this massive depression.
Right.
And over time, that depression filled with water.
Rainwater and groundwater.
Rainwater, groundwater, exactly.
Okay.
And because there's no natural outlet for the water,
Mhm.
it's just kind of this closed system.
Right.
It's become very alkaline and saline
Oh, okay.
because of the minerals in the surrounding basalt rock.
So it's leaching those minerals out of the rock over time.
Exactly. It's like a giant natural chemistry experiment.
Right.
Yeah, it's been going on for millennia. And it's still going on. I mean, it's still a very active system.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's the basic story
Right.
of how Lonar Lake came to be.
But let's dig a little deeper into the evidence.
Okay.
Right? I mean, you said that this is the theory with the most, scientific backing.
Right.
But for someone who's, maybe hearing this for the first time, or maybe they've read some of these alternative theories,
Mm-hmm.
what would you say is the most compelling evidence that really points to
An impact event.
an impact event? Yeah.
Well, if you look at the rock formations around the lake,
Okay.
you find features that are really only created by a huge impact.
Okay, so like what?
Things like what we call shock metamorphism.
Shock metamorphism. Okay.
And that's where the minerals in the rock have been altered
Okay.
by incredible pressure and heat.
Like the kind of pressure and heat you would only get
A
there.
massive impact.
A massive impact, yeah.
Oh, okay.
And then you have what are called shatter cones?
Shatter cones.
Okay.
And these are these distinctive cone-shaped fractures in the rock
Oh, wow.
that radiate outwards from the point of impact.
Okay.
So these are like geological fingerprints
Wow.
that just scream high velocity impact.
So it's not just any old crack in a rock. It's a very specific
Very specific pattern.
that tells you
This was a huge impact.
this was a huge impact.
Yeah, you don't find these just anywhere.
Okay.
They're pretty much exclusive to impact sites.
All right. So we've got shock metamorphism. We've got shatter cones.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned the water chemistry as well.
Right.
And you were saying that that's not just a coincidence.
No, it's directly tied to that basalt rock
Right.
that makes up the surrounding area.
So explain that connection a little bit more.
Sure. So as the water sits in the crater,
Mm-hmm.
it interacts with the basalt
Yeah.
and it slowly dissolves certain minerals.
Right.
And those minerals leach into the water.
Okay.
And that's what gives it that high alkalinity and salinity.
So it's a very gradual process.
Right.
Very gradual, yeah, over thousands of years.
Okay, and what's really fascinating to me is
Right.
that, you've got these microorganisms, these extremophiles that live in that water.
Right.
And they've evolved to actually thrive
Yeah.
in these conditions.
It's amazing.
It's like a completely self-contained ecosystem.
Yeah, a unique little world
Yeah.
that's adapted to this very specific environment.
And what about the shape itself? I mean, the near perfect circularity, is
Yeah.
that also something that you typically see with
Impact events.
impact events? Yeah.
Absolutely. If
Okay.
you look at impact craters around the world,
Mm-hmm.
and even on other planets,
Yeah.
that circular shape is a very common feature.
Okay.
It's created by that initial impact
Right.
that digs out this big bowl-shaped depression,
Right.
and then the material that's ejected from the crater
Mm-hmm.
forms that raised rim around the edge.
So even though it looks kind of unnatural,
Right, it's almost too perfect.
it's actually a very typical characteristic of impact craters.
So it seems like the scientific narrative here is pretty
Solid.
solid. Yeah, I mean they've got multiple lines of evidence
Mm.
that all seem to point in the same direction.
Exactly.
Of course, as we've been hinting at,
There are some things that don't quite fit.
there's some things that don't quite fit. Yeah, and those are the things that have really kind of fueled
The alternative theories.
the alternative theories. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So, what are some of the key points of contention?
Mm-hmm.
What are the things that make people question
The impact theory.
the impact theory?
Yeah. Well, one of the biggest ones is that no one has ever found meteorite.
The meteorite.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, you would think for an impact crater,
That size,
that size,
you'd find at least some big chunks of the meteorite
Yeah.
somewhere.
right, either in the crater itself or
Scattered around.
tattered around. Yeah.
But despite lots of searching, no one's ever found any significant pieces.
So what do scientists say about that?
Well, they say that the meteorite could have vaporized on impact,
Yeah.
or that it broke up into really small pieces
Right.
that are now buried deep underground or
Right.
scattered far and wide.
But for people who are, kind of skeptical of the impact theory, that missing meteorite is a big deal.
It's a big red flag.
Yeah.
It opens the door for other explanations.
Right. What if it wasn't a meteorite at all?
Exactly. What if it was something else entirely that caused that crater?
And then there's the issue of the magnetic anomalies.
Right. Those are strange.
Yeah, I mean, when you first read about those, what went through your mind?
Well, it definitely piqued my interest.
Yeah.
Geologists often say that these magnetic anomalies
Mhm.
are just caused by, the minerals in the basalt
Right.
or by changes in the rock caused by the impact.
Okay.
But some people think that these anomalies were a sign of something more unusual.
Okay, so like what?
Well, some people think that they're evidence of advanced technology, either
Yeah.
from aliens
Right.
or from some lost civilization.
Right.
Something with electromagnetic properties that wouldn't be associated with a typical meteorite impact.
So it's not just that there are magnetic anomalies, it's the specific patterns of those anomalies
Exactly.
that are kind of hard to explain.
Yeah, they suggest a level of complexity that's not usually seen in natural geological formations.
Okay, and then there's the depth of the lake.
Mm-hmm.
Some people have pointed out that it seems a little
Disproportionate.
disproportionate,
Yeah.
to its diameter.
To its diameter compared to other impact craters of a similar size.
Right.
Yeah.
So what are some of the interpretations of that?
Well, some people think that maybe the impactor hit a weak spot in the Earth's crust,
Okay.
and that allowed it to penetrate deeper than it normally would.
Okay.
Others think that maybe it wasn't a typical impact at all. Maybe it was something else that created that deep depression.
So maybe not a meteorite.
Something else entirely.
Something else entirely, yeah.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there's the water itself. We
Mm.
talked about the alkalinity and the salinity.
Mm.
But the fact that it supports these unique life forms,
Yeah. The
the
extremophiles.
extremophiles,
They're pretty amazing.
they are. And,
Yeah.
and it does make you wonder,
Mhm.
is it just a coincidence that these organisms evolved to thrive in these very specific conditions?
Right.
Or was there something else at play?
Exactly. It almost feels like the environment was tailor-made for them.
Yeah, like it was designed or something.
Yeah, it's a very specific set of conditions
Yeah.
that they need to survive.
So we've got a missing meteorite.
Mm-hmm.
We've got magnetic anomalies.
Yep.
We've got an unusual depth.
Right.
And we've got this water chemistry that seems almost too perfect.
For the life that it supports.
For the life that it supports, yeah.
Yeah.
It's not hard to see why people would start to look for alternative explanation.
Exactly. When you have these unanswered questions,
Mm-hmm.
and you combine that with our natural curiosity about the unknown,
Right?
it's a recipe for speculation.
And that's where the conspiracy theories come in.
Exactly.
So let's talk about some of the most popular ones.
Okay.
And the one that probably gets the most attention
Is the alien base theory.
is the alien base theory. Yeah.
Yeah.
So how does that one work?
Well, the idea is that Lonar Lake isn't an impact crater at all,
Okay.
but it's actually a landing site.
Okay.
Or maybe even a base.
For an alien.
For aliens, yeah.
Well-
And they use the same anomalies that we've been talking about as
Right.
evidence.
Okay, so walk me through that.
So the circular shape,
Mm-hmm.
that's not from an impact.
Right.
It's because it was constructed
By aliens.
by aliens, yeah.
Okay.
The magnetic anomalies,
Mm-hmm.
those are from their technology,
Okay.
you know, their power sources or their ships or whatever.
Yeah.
Right.
And the missing meteorite.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's because it wasn't a meteorite. It was an alien spacecraft.
That may be disintegrated or something.
Right. Maybe it crashed and burned up.
Or they took it with them.
Or they
You're
took it with
right.
them, yeah.
Right. Who knows?
Yeah. So it's a pretty neat explanation.
It is. It's a nice way to tie all those loose ends together.
Yeah. It kind of accounts for all the things that don't make sense.
Right.
With the impact theory.
Exactly.
And then there's the ancient weapon test theory.
Yeah, that one's interesting too.
Yeah, this one's really intriguing because it taps into that idea.
Of lost
It's
civilizations.
Lost civilizations, yeah.
With advanced technology.
Right. Maybe a technology that we can't even comprehend.
Exactly.
So how would Lonar Lake fit into that narrative?
Well, the idea is that the lake was created by a weapon,
Okay.
an ancient weapon.
Wow.
Maybe something like a super powerful energy beam,
Right.
or a sonic weapon, or who knows.
Yeah.
And the circular shape of the lake, that's the blast radius and the unusual water chemistry.
Mm-hmm.
That's the residue from the weapon.
Okay.
You know, whatever it was that they used.
So it's like a giant score
Yeah.
left behind
By this ancient conflict.
from some forgotten war.
Exactly. And there are all sorts of myths and legends about these ancient civilizations with powerful weapons.
Right. So this theory kind of ties into that whole
Body of lore.
body of lore, yeah.
Yeah.
And then there's the always popular government cover-up.
Oh, yeah, that's a classic.
Yeah. Why do you think that's such a common theme?
Well, I think it speaks to a certain distrust of authority.
Right.
You know, the idea that governments are hiding things from us,
Yeah.
especially when it comes to things like aliens or advanced technology,
Right, because those are things that could potentially
cause panic.
cause panic.
You know, if people knew that aliens were real or that our government had recovered some kind of super weapon,
Right.
that could be destabilizing.
Yeah. And so in the context of Lonar Lake, what are some of the things that people point to?
As evidence of a cover-up.
Yeah, as evidence of a cover-up.
Well, things like restricted access to the site.
Okay.
You know, maybe there are certain areas that you're not allowed to go to.
Yeah.
Or the fact that the government might downplay any unusual findings.
Right.
You know, they might say, oh, it's just a natural phenomenon.
Right, nothing to see here.
Nothing to see here, move along.
Right.
But to conspiracy theorists, that's proof that they're hiding something.
Right. They're trying to keep it under wraps.
Exactly.
And then we have perhaps the most
Out there.
out there theory, which is the portal theory.
The portal theory, yeah, this one's a little more fringe.
Yeah, I mean, this is really getting into the realm of
Speculation.
yeah.
Yeah.
So what's the basic idea here?
Well, the idea is that Lonar Lake is a portal.
A portal to
Another dimension.
another dimension.
Or another reality. And the unusual properties of the lake, the extremophiles, the magnetic anomalies,
Right.
those are all side effects of this interdimensional connection.
So it's like a window
Yeah.
into another reality.
Exactly. And the missing meteorite is irrelevant in this theory
Right.
because the lake wasn't formed by an impact.
Right. It was formed
It's
by
some kind of interdimensional event.
like a rift in space-time or something.
Faithfully.
Yeah. So we've got this whole spectrum of explanations.
Yeah, from the very scientific to the very fantastical.
Right. And it's fascinating to me how, you know, people can look at the same set of facts
And come to such different conclusions.
and come to such different conclusions. It really shows the power of belief.
It does, yeah. And I think it's important to remember that, you know, these alternative theories, they're not necessarily wrong.
Yeah, they're just not supported by the evidence.
Right, they're not the most likely explanation.
Exactly.
But let's dig a little deeper into some of the specific points, okay?
That are often cited as evidence.
By the conspiracy theorists.
By the conspiracy theorists, yeah.
Yeah.
So we talked about the circular shape and how that's seen as evidence of
artificial construction.
Artificial construction, yeah.
Yeah.
But we also talked about how circular craters are actually quite common.
Right, in impact events.
In impact events, yeah.
Yeah.
So what's the counter argument there?
Well, the counter argument is that yes, circular craters are common, but Lonar Lake is almost too perfect.
Okay.
You know, it's almost unnaturally round.
Right.
And that's what makes some people think that it must have been
engineered,
yeah.
Yeah.
And then there are the magnetic anomalies. And those are often interpreted as signs of
advanced technology.
Yeah. But we also talked about how those anomalies could have natural explanation.
Right.
Right. So what's the counter argument there?
Well, the counter argument is that the magnetic anomalies at Lonar Lake
are just too complex
to
be explained by natural processes.
Right. So they're not just random fluctuations in the magnetic field.
Right.
There's a pattern there.
There's a pattern there that suggests something more deliberate.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then there are the extremophiles. And those are often cited as evidence of
an extraterrestrial origin.
Yeah. But we also talked about how extremophiles are actually found in all sorts of extreme environments.
Right. They're all over the planet.
Yeah. So what's the counter argument there?
Well, the counter-argument is that the extremophiles at Lonar Lake are unique.
Yep.
They're not found anywhere else on Earth.
Right. So it's not just that they can survive in extreme conditions.
Right.
It's that they're specifically adapted
to Lonar Lake.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then there are the local legends, which are often seen as
corroborating evidence.
Yeah. But of course, legends are, by their very nature,
stories.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what's the counter argument there?
Well, the counter argument is that legends can be influenced by all sorts of things.
Right.
You know, by people's imaginations, by their fears, by their hopes,
by their desire to explain the unexplainable.
Exactly.
And so they're not necessarily reliable sources of information.
Right.
And then of course there's the missing meteorite.
Right. That's the big one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's often seen as the
nail in the coffin.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For the impact theory.
Yeah.
But we also talked about how the meteorite could have vaporized or fragmented.
Yeah.
So what's the counter argument there?
Well, the counter argument is that if the meteorite vaporized, there should be some evidence of that.
Right.
You know, there should be some kind of trace elements
in the soil
or in the water. But no one's ever found anything.
So it's like it just vanished.
It's like it just disappeared.
Into thin air.
Yeah.
So we got all these counter arguments. But let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the motives.
For the cover-up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Why would anyone want to hide the truth?
About Lonar Lake,
yeah.
Well, there are a few different possibilities.
Okay.
One possibility is to prevent panic.
Right.
You know, if people knew that aliens were real or that our government had recovered some kind of ancient superweapon, that could cause widespread chaos.
Yeah. People might freak out.
Yeah. And the government might want to avoid that at all costs.
So it's like a paternalistic kind of.
Yeah, they're protecting us from ourselves.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then there's the national security angle.
Right. If Lonar Lake is an alien base, or if it's the site of an ancient weapon test, that's information that other countries would want to know.
Right, and that we would want them to know.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the government might want to keep it a secret.
Right, to maintain our advantage.
Yeah.
And then there's the possibility of technological advancement. If we could reverse engineer alien technology, or if we could figure out how to build
ancient superweapons,
that
would give us a huge edge.
Yeah, it would be a game changer.
It would be a game changer, yeah.
And then there's the idea of maintaining the status quo. If Lonar Lake proves that aliens exist, or that ancient civilizations had advanced technology,
that would challenge a lot of our fundamental beliefs.
It would turn our whole worldview upside down.
It would, yeah. And some people might not be ready for that.
Right, it would be too disruptive.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of reasons why someone might want to
keep Lonar Lake a secret.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But let's go back to the scientific evidence.
Right.
And talk about why the impact theory is still
The most likely explanation.
The most likely explanation.
Yeah, yeah.
So we talked about the shock metamorphism and the shatter cones.
Yep. Those are pretty definitive.
Yeah, they're pretty hard to explain away.
Yeah, those are the hallmarks of an impact event.
And the shape of the lake itself. You know, the circularity.
The raised rim.
The raised rim.
It's all consistent with what we see
at other impact craters.
Or other impact craters, yeah, around the world and even on other planets.
And what about the magnetic anomalies?
Well, as we discussed, those can be explained by
natural processes.
Natural processes.
Yeah. The basalt rock in that area naturally contains magnetic minerals.
Yeah.
And the impact itself could have altered those minerals in a way that created the anomalies that we see today.
So it's not necessarily evidence of
alien technology.
Alien technology, yeah.
Right.
And then the extremophiles.
You know, those can also be explained by natural processes,
Yet life is incredibly adaptable.
Right.
And it can evolve to survive in all sorts of extreme environments.
So it's not that surprising that we would find unique organisms.
Living in Lonar Lake.
Living in Lonar Lake,
Yeah.
And finally, the missing meteorite. You know, as we said, it's possible that it
or
vaporized or fragmented on impact.
Or fragmented.
And that those fragments are just
too small.
Too small to be easily found.
Or too dispersed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So while the alternative theories are definitely intriguing, the scientific evidence
still points to an impact.
Yeah. And I think that's an important takeaway.
I agree.
You know, it's great to have an open mind.
Absolutely.
And to explore all the possibilities. But it's also important to
stick to the facts.
Yeah. And the facts in this case
suggest that Lonar Lake was created by a meteorite impact.
Yeah, it's a pretty amazing story.
It is. Yeah. It's a reminder of the power of nature.
Yeah. And the fact that, you know, these events can happen
at any time. Yeah.
So it's something to think about.
Absolutely.
You know, the next time you look up at the night sky and you see a shooting star.
Right. You never know what might be heading our way.
You never know. Yeah. So I think that's a good place to leave it for today.
I think so too.
But before we go, I want to leave you with one final thought.
Okay.
You know, we've talked a lot about the science of Lonar Lake. And we've talked a lot about the conspiracy theories.
Right.
But I think it's also worth thinking about
the human element.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Why are we so drawn to these extraordinary explanations? You know, why do we want to believe in aliens and ancient super weapons?
And portals to other dimensions.
Yeah. I think it's because we're looking for meaning. We're looking for something.
Bigger than ourselves.
Yeah. We want to believe that there's more to the universe
than meets the eye.
Yeah. And I think that's a beautiful thing.
I do too.
You know,